Hi, welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to show you how to bleed the brakes on your Lamborghini Gallardo. We're going to be performing this on my Lamborghini Gallardo Superleggera with the optional carbon ceramic brakes. But lucky for you, if you have a base Gallardo, it's actually going to be a lot easier than how I show it in this video. But we'll get into that. First off, I wanted to show you what kind of brake fluid I recommend and when you should actually use it. And then I also wanted to talk to you about a little bit of brake tech and some common pitfalls that you might experience when bleeding the brakes. And at the end, we're also going to talk about when you should actually do this to your car and how to know if it's actually an issue. So stick around to the end for that. If you like this video, I really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. My main goal with this channel is to help as many people out as possible and to really destigmatize the ideal that working on an exotic is a hard thing to do and it's intimidating. So if you could do that, I'd really appreciate it, and I want to get this video out to as many people as possible. So the two brake fluids I really recommend for your car is the ATE Type 200 Racing and the Castrol React SRF Racing. This one is about $15 a liter, and this one is about $70. And I'm going to go into lots of detail regarding what the key difference between these two is. And to be honest with you, it's not just snake oil. So there's actual proven data behind these two, and it's an important distinction. But it's going to depend on how you drive your car. So stick around for the end for that one, and I'll tell you exactly why that is. But for today, we're going to be putting in ATE Type 200. I bought 2 liters so I can get a really good flush out of the system. And I mean, for 30 bucks, this is an excellent brake fluid, so I really can't recommend it more. So the first thing you want to do is you're going to want to pop off this little cover to get access to the brake fluid reservoir. And it's really far back here, so we're going to have to be very careful when it comes to filling this. We're going to want to get a nice funnel that we can actually get access into the back of this system. Brake fluid does like to eat paint, so we have to be very careful when it comes to filling this and draining it. So personally, I'm going to remove the whole front trunk assembly and show you what's back here on the actual braking system. All right, now that I have the front trunk out, we can really get a good look at what we have here. So we have the brake fluid reservoir, the master cylinder right here, and then the brake booster behind that as well. And then this is the ABS control unit. So there's 2 camps when it comes to bleeding your brakes. There's the people that will tell you that you need to bleed the ABS control unit to get a proper bleed out of the system. And then there's the people that will tell you that all you have to do is just bleed the brakes through the lines and then through the calipers, and you should be good to go. I've done both personally. Done it where I've bled the ABS control unit using diagnostic software with the system just by bleeding it, and when the system was fully dry. Honestly, I'm in the second camp when it comes to telling you just to bleed it through the brake calipers and don't even worry about the ABS control unit. Because if you look closely, the brake lines come out of the master cylinder into these 2 ports for the front and rear brakes, and then goes through the ABS control unit, the valving, and then it comes out to the front wheels and then the rear wheels behind it. So honestly, if it goes to the same system and it comes right out the same system, I'm not too concerned about it, and we should get a really good bleed out of this. And this is why I'm bleeding the brakes on my car. You can see it's a little bit darker than it should be. I said in an earlier video it kind of looked like Shrek, and I'm not really that far off. So if you're unaware, a new can of brake fluid should be kind of like an amber color, and this is far from it. So now that we have access to the brake fluid reservoir, we're going to be doing this bleeding in 2 parts. The first part is going to involve us getting as much of that old brake fluid out as possible and trying to replace it with new fluid. And once that is accomplished, we're going to come back and do a final bleed on the entire system. And that will ensure that we get as much of the old brake fluid out as possible and any residual air that might be located in the system somewhere. And what you'll be left with at the end of the day is an amazing brake pedal feel. So to get the old fluid out of the reservoir, we're going to want to bleed a caliper in the front and a caliper in the rear. And this is done for a very specific reason, because in most master cylinder reservoirs, there's a barrier separating the front lines from the rear lines. And this is done for a very specific reason. Let's say hypothetically you damaged your front brakes and all the fluid drained out of those front lines. You'd still have fluid in the rear lines and subsequently braking pressure. and that would allow you to stop successfully. So now that we're at the wheel of the car, we're gonna find brake bleeders on the top of the caliper. And if you have a base Gallardo, you're gonna see a 8-piston monoblock caliper. This is the optional carbon ceramic. So I have 6-piston calipers in the front and then 6-piston in the rear. And you're gonna have 8-piston in the front and then 4-piston in the rear. But the procedure is identical. So what we're gonna wanna do is we're gonna wanna get our brake bleeder. This can even be just a canister with a line going into it, like a water bottle even. And I'll be sure to link that in the description for you. So if you see this little port right here, we're gonna wanna get a screwdriver or some sort of implementation and pop that little dust cap off. And then it will stay just like that. And then we're gonna wanna get an 11 mil spanner and put it on top of the port, just like that. And then we're gonna wanna get our line for our brake bleeder and press it right on top of it. And then turning it maybe a quarter of a turn, gently, see here, opens the hydraulic pressure, and then we can finally bleed the front channels of this system. So when we crack open the system for this initial bleed, what we're gonna try to do is you can see there's a max line and a minimum line. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna drain the brake fluid to the minimum line and then get a new canister of brake fluid and then fill it back up to the max. And we're gonna do this for a whole entire liter of brake fluid, just to ensure that we get the majority of the old brake fluid out and we can replace it with new brake fluid. And then we're gonna come back and we're gonna bleed the whole entire system properly. And that will ensure that all the lines going to the front and rear all have brand new brake fluid, including the calipers. Next, you're gonna hop in the car with the lines open and start pumping the brakes. I recommend pumping the brakes maybe 10 times and then checking the fluid reservoir and seeing where you're at on the level. And then once you hit the minimum level, we're gonna go ahead and fill it right back up. We're gonna do this for both front and rear. So for the front, we're gonna use about a half a liter of brake fluid, and then for the rear, we're gonna use the remaining half a liter. And if you find that your brake pedal is like really hard to press down during this procedure, try cracking the bleeder valve on top of the caliper just another quarter of a turn, and that should alleviate a lot of that pressure. So to fill the system, we're gonna mask off the area with a rag or something like that, just to ensure that we don't get any of the brake fluid on the paint. And then we're gonna get a funnel, nice long funnel, and you have to make sure that it's clean. And we're gonna be pouring in the brake fluid very slowly. There's an internal filter in the reservoir. So if you pour it in too fast, it might fill past that little filter and go all over your paintwork. So just be extremely careful, just go very slow and fill it back up to that max line that you can see on the brake fluid reservoir. Just the same when removing it, you have to be extremely careful. Don't put it in any place that's dirty because you do not want to contaminate your brake fluid that you just replaced. Try to just really be careful to avoid any sort of paint or plastics or anything like that. And you might notice that when you do this procedure, that this little passageway inside the brake fluid reservoir never empties. And this is okay because this is actually for the line for the clutch master cylinder for a 6-speed manual car. Since this is an e-gear car, this is actually capped off from the factory. So nothing to worry about there. And unfortunately, we will never be able to get to this part. So now that we roughly bled the front channel, we're gonna tighten it back up and make sure to have a rag handy. I'm gonna pull this off just like that. And I'm gonna pinch the line and then gently pull it off. I just wanna ensure that I do not get any sort of brake fluid on this, this caliper. And then I'm gonna come back with a rag and daub it off. And we're just gonna leave that dust cap off just for right now. So the rear of the car is exactly the same as the front. If you have a regular Gallardo, you're gonna have a smaller rear caliper, but it's still a Brembo monoblock caliper and the procedure is exactly the same. Just have to be very careful when it comes to putting this brake line on. And then we can roughly bleed the rear channel. Crack it open, go. There we go. Awesome. Just like that. So I just went ahead and drained half a liter out of the braking reservoir, and you can see how dirty that fluid is as it travels through the hose. And now that we have the rear channel bled roughly, we can close it back up. Again, be careful with that brake fluid. Do not want to mess up the finish of this caliper. Okay, so now that we have all the old brake fluid out of that master cylinder reservoir, we can finally do our final bleed on the system and get all the old brake fluid out of the calipers and out of the existing lines. So you might ask, well, so you're gonna say I have to bleed the whole entire system again? And yes, so I've tried it where I've tried to get like a turkey baster and like try to suck the brake fluid out of the master cylinder reservoir. And there's internal galleys inside the system and I've never been able to effectively get it all out. And it's also very messy. So I've gotten brake fluid all over paint before. It's just not fun. So that's one thing I really can't recommend. And honestly, the easiest thing to do is what I just showed you, is just to crack the lines on the front and rear calipers, press the brake pedal a bunch of times and keep on filling the master cylinder reservoir of fluid. And now we'll get all that old brake fluid out, and now we can go into this step. So first thing we're gonna do is jack up the rear of the car. This is what I have to do. If you have 4-piston monoblock calipers in the rear, it's gonna be a lot easier, and I'm gonna show you exactly why. So now that we have the caliper off, we can see exactly what I'm talking about. So the brake line travels from right here into the caliper, and then underneath, through this line, and then up. And if you have a Brembo monoblock caliper, you're actually gonna have 2 bleed valves. So there's pistons on this side, and there's pistons on this side. So this bleed valve is why I have to take off the wheel. I just can't physically get my hand back there to get a spanner on it. And this tire is a 295 section width, so it's just gonna be impossible to get it from behind. It's just a mess. But if you have a 4-piston monoblock caliper in the rear, this is actually on my Touareg. I think this caliper could definitely use to be repainted, maybe just cleaned. You can get your hand back behind there and get that 11mm wrench onto the back. And that's the major difference. So you might be able to avoid actually jacking up the car, but I can't. So just something to keep in mind. So to perform this final bleed, we're going to start on the caliper that is furthest away from the ABS control unit. And in this case, since our ABS control unit is located in the front left portion of the car, we're going to be starting on the rear right caliper. And then we're going to be moving to the rear left, the front right, and then finally the front left to finish off. And the procedure is exactly the same as it was before. We ensure that our brake fluid is topped off to the maximum amount. We crack the line, and then we start pumping the brake pedal. So you might argue that I actually need 2 people for this, where one person is pressing down the brake pedal, and then the other person is actually cracking the line and then letting the system bleed and then closing it back up. I would argue against this. I've never experienced any sort of air intrusion with this method, and it's something that I really honestly can't recommend. I've never experienced any sort of adverse effects due to this, and I've always had excellent brake pedal feel on the street and on the track. So something I really can't recommend, and it's not really necessary. So calipers of this nature, we're going to start on the bleed valve that is inboard of the car, and then we're going to do the bleed valve that is outboard of the car, closest to the outside edge of the vehicle. So I'm going to start on the rearmost portion of the car and show exactly what I'm doing, and then we're going to move to the fronts. And so just like before, you put the 11mm spanner on the back, and like I said, if you have smaller brake calipers, you can do this without even taking the wheel off, and then crack the line. There we go. Just like that. Then we're gonna hop in the car and start pumping the brakes. Probably about 10 times, since all we're trying to do is get the remaining brake fluid that's dirty out of the lines and out of the caliper. So the only brake fluid that is bad that is left in the system is the residual left in the caliper and in the lines. So once you see that the lines are clear like a brand new can of brake fluid, that's a good indication that this caliper is bled successfully, and you can move on to the next one. So moving on to the front of this caliper, it's the same exact procedure of loosening the bleeder valve and then attaching the line and then allowing it to bleed until the fluid is clear. I decided against showing you the other rear caliper since it's exactly the same, and I thought it would be a little bit too redundant. And after you finish each caliper, be sure to fill up the brake fluid reservoir with more brake fluid just to make sure that you don't run dry in the system. And with this car, if the carbon ceramic brakes, the calipers are exactly the same in the front and the rear. So same procedure for the front. And you might actually notice that it's a little bit easier to pump the brakes when you are bleeding the front end. And that's because of the distance from the master cylinder to the actual caliper is a little bit shorter. So after we bled all 4 calipers, we're going to top off the brake fluid reservoir one last time, tighten the cap, and then put that little lid right back on it. Now that I thought would be a good time to talk to you about brake tech and why those 2 fluids are so different and why one is $70 and the other one is $15 a liter. So let's get into that. So there's a few different types of brake fluid. There's .3, .4, .5, and .5.1, most commonly seen. .3, .4, and .5.1 are all glycol based, and then .5 is silicone based. And you usually don't see .5 in most automobiles unless you have some specialized electronic braking system, or you have an older vehicle that doesn't get driven that often, like a classic car. So in the Lamborghini, we use .4, and that's really common with a lot of cars. Sometimes you see .3, but .3 and .4 are the most common ones. And the big difference between these two and a lot of brake fluids is the wet boiling point and the dry boiling point. So dry boiling point is the temperature at which the brake fluid boils when you first open the cap and it's a brand new case of brake fluid, and that's the temperature. And then the wet boiling point is the temperature at which it boils after it's absorbed 3.7% water by weight. So over time, brake fluid, it does like to absorb water, and it is hydroscopic, so it just has a tendency to do that. And that's why I recommend replacing your brake fluid every 3 years. And that's why they rate that dry boiling point and wet boiling point. So basically you understand what the brake fluid is going to perform like when it's brand new, and also it's what it's going to perform like after a couple years down the road. If you ever see carbon ceramic brakes on like the racetrack, they glow red hot, and they get very, very hot. And that includes steel brakes as well. So the big difference between these two is that this Caster React SRF Racing has a much higher boiling point, dry boiling point and wet boiling point than ATE Type 200. And this is a high performance brake fluid too. But the Caster React SRF is just miles ahead of it. I'll leave a chart showing the dry boiling point and wet boiling point for these two brake fluids. And what I'd really recommend for you is for the street, I'd recommend just a street fluid. And then for the track, I really recommend something like this. It's such a noticeable difference, and it's going to prevent you from boiling your brakes on the racetrack. And it's something really I recommend, and it's definitely worth the money. But for the street, you're really never going to notice anything like that. So please just save your money and don't even bother buying a racing brake fluid. This says racing on it. I'm sure you could use it for some sort of minimal track use, but yeah, it's in the noise. But for the price, with this being $15 a liter and this being $70, it just makes sense to buy this. If you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing. I really appreciate it. And if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments box down below. I'd really appreciate any input that you could give me, or anything that I might have gone glazed over, or any questions that you may have regarding this procedure. I'd love to hear them, and I'd love to help as many people as possible. So if you could do that, I'd really appreciate it. And until next time, thanks.